heard of Samuel H. Moffat. He was the son of Presbyterian pastors or missionaries in Korea, and he followed in the family business, so to speak. And he was a missionary in Korea and finally in China. And what I want to tell you about is that his leaving China, because he was in China when Mao Zedong and his group started putting people in prison. And he was imprisoned for 2 years. And trust me, Chinese prisons were not nice places to live for a week, let alone for 2 years. And during that time, they worked on him day and night, trying to convince him that Mao Zedong was the hope of the world. But he stood firm and he stood faithful. He was finally released when they took him to trial and found him guilty of embezzlement. Not sure how they figured that out, but they found him guilty of embezzlement, and he had to leave the country as soon as possible. Now, when they gave him that sentence, they also required him to sign a sheet of paper that would say how much money he would take out of the country. And he did, but he put down $100 because that was the best he could think that he might have to leave the country. Well, he went home, gathered up his stuff, his wife, and $97. That was all he could find. Now, this man who remained faithful and hopeful all the way through prison, 2 years of prison, 2 years of being told lies, he started to lose hope. And he decided, because he was missing $3, they were going to let him out of China. Well, he lived in inland China, so he had to make the trip to Canton, which is on the south coast, in order to get out. So he and his wife packed up and went days to get to Canton. And all the way, every mile, his hopelessness grew because he was missing $3. On the way, they did meet a couple that were with China Inland Missions, and they asked he and his wife, if they would take their son Oswald. Because at that time, these people could not get papers to leave the country. But the Chinese were not requiring there be papers for children. And so they wanted to make sure their son, at least, was able to get out of China. And they agreed to do that. Well, so they're taking Oswald. This is Oswald Guinness. Some of you may have heard of him. He's written a lot of books himself once he grew up. And they made their way to Canton, and they watched as people their luggage was searched, and then their person was searched, and then they finally came up, and their luggage was being searched, and finally Oswald said to Samuel Moffat, he said, well, are they going to search me too? And Samuel said, yes, they will, but you don't have to worry, because what they're looking for is American money, and you don't have any. And Oswald said, but I do. I've got $3. Well, Samuel says after that, he said, you know, that was a miracle, those $3. And I think the reason for it was is that God looked down and said, look at that missionary mind. He's tired, he's weak, he's losing his faith. I don't want him to leave like that, having a nervous breakdown, leaving China. So God gave him those $3. But he said, what about all those people that were not able to leave? And there were many. And you might have heard of stories of some missionaries who died in prison in China. And many Chinese Christians as well as missionaries. And he said, what about them? Does that mean there was no hope for them? And he decided that no, as a matter of fact, that is a greater miracle, that those who were not able to leave were the people who had that miracle of faith and trust and hope. That, he says, was the real miracle. It wasn't that God gave me $3, but that they were able to keep their hope in the God of the hope of the world, and they did not give up. And that somehow that is more of a miracle in those difficult times. I think that Stephen could probably speak to that. Of course, he lived centuries, literally centuries, before Samuel Moffat and Mao Zedong. But Stephen was a great guy, wasn't he? I mean, here was a man, his faith and his life of faith was so compelling that he was elected to a very important position of caring for the widows and making sure that everyone got a fair share. And Stephen was a great guy. And yet someone brought up lies against him. And he ended up being stoned. Now, what about him? Did he lose hope? Did he finally decide, oh, this God that I've trusted and that I've lived for these, I don't know, days, weeks, months, I don't know. It's not too long after the resurrection, and we have no idea where he was right after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But we do know he was a great guy, and he did not lose hope. And I at least don't think he did, because when they took him out to the city and they started stoning him, he started praying. I think he had hope that God was present there and that God was compassionate. And I'm sure of it because the last thing that he said before he died was asking God to not hold their sins against them, to forgive those people who are killing him. That's hope. Not hope that things will turn out the way I want them to turn out. That's the kind of hope that says, I know that God, no matter how many no's I hear from God, there is going to be a yes. And the yes will ultimately triumph. But how about you and me? I've always wondered, because, you know me, I love everything about China, and I've thought sometimes, I wonder what I would have done if I had been thrown into prison in China. I don't know. But I do know that I've had times, and maybe you have too, when you've begun to feel a little hopeless, thinking, you know, God's abandoned me, or it's just, I don't understand what God is up to. And I've heard a lot of people say, if they're undergoing some difficult times, they say, why me? I'm a good person. I've lived a good life. Why me? Why is this terrible thing happening to me? Or if one of their wonderful friends gets cancer, or some kind of terrible thing happens to them, and they say, why that person? They're a good person. Why would that happen? And we're saying, why does God say no? And ultimately, it appears to be that God's no is never the last word. But something is going to come after it, and it's going to be finally a yes. Now we can look at Stephen. One of the things that happened after Stephen was stoned was that this church that was growing and thriving, I mean, talk about church growth. They were having thousands of people added to their number a day. I mean, they had church growth. Nobody could write a book like that and anybody believe it. But all of a sudden, they had to flee Jerusalem. This was a dangerous place for followers of the way, which was what Jesus' followers were called at that time. And off they went, all over. Did they lose hope? I'm thinking not, because it says, and wherever they went, they preached the good news. They hadn't lost hope. They just didn't know what all this no was. You can't live here anymore. But they did know that God was still the God that would say yes. And they took that with them as they went. And I think that for us as well, there are times when we need to remember that whenever there is a no, it's kind of like the dark tunnel I talked about many weeks ago now. But hope is always the light at the end of every dark tunnel. Hope says God is going to say yes, and he's going to say yes in a mighty and powerful way. We know this because his ultimate no was to evil on the cross. And we know that hope is the light at the end of every dark tunnel because the resurrection was God's mighty yes. And we have hope because we know that is who God is. And as one writer says, hope is what motivates us, what keeps us going, what helps us to keep doing things, because he said if we're hopeless, we don't want to do anything. Just kind of want to veg out on the sofa and just forget everything. And I read about a Peanuts cartoon, and you guys remember Peanuts. Well, it's still in a lot of papers. And you remember Lucy? Bossy knows everything Lucy. Well, she had a little brother, Linus, right? And there's one particular cartoon that has Lucy and Linus sitting in front of a television set. And Lucy turns to Linus and says, "Go get me a glass of water." And Linus, in the next frame, looks at her and says, "Why should I do anything for you? You never do anything for me." And she says, "When you are 75 years old for your birthday, I'm going to bake you a cake." And in the next frame, we see Linus going to get her a cup of water. And he says as he goes, "Life is always more pleasant when you have something to look forward to." He had hope that one day Lucy would give him. Now, I wouldn't put a lot of hope in that, but myself, knowing Lucy the way we know her. But he's right. Linus is right. And we have that kind of hope that is greater than maybe a selfish sister is going to make us a cake on our 75th birthday. No, we have hope in the God who has said no to evil and yes to all that is good. The God who loves us and actually is the one who is in control of this world. And so we have hope that keeps us going, that makes life a little more pleasant along the way, even when the tunnel is dark. Even when we feel like God has said no, we still have that hope that makes life just a little more pleasant and also motivates us to want others to know of this great hope so that when they hear no, they can know there is a yes, a magnificent, mighty yes coming. Amen.